think that you would have stage fright. Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. This is the RF Fod.
Take two.
I never did that before. This is going to be fun. Okay. Hello, everyone. This is the RF Factor podcast, episode number 9, with Pete Gagliardi and me, Ray Gadetti. Hey, Pete, how you doing over there? You looking good?
Good, Ray. How are you doing, man? And look, it's nice to be back to another RF Factor. And we have a great one lined up today, man.
And why do you say that?
Oh, we have usually in the RF Factor, we have somebody from an organization talking about leadership issues. But today, we have somebody talking from an organization whose organization is interdependent with two others. We have someone representing the organization of prosecutors, for example. Mm-hmm. And they're completely interdependent. Their success is interdependent upon what the police do and what the forensic community does in terms of the criminal investigations that they move forward in court. So I think it's unique in that sense that we're going to be talking about leadership issues, not only within an organization, but across separate organizational disciplines. And that's why I think it's exciting today. But for the benefit of the audience, the letters RF stand for relentless follow-up. And it's a key factor when trying to implement new policies and procedures within an organization, for example. It's often the most difficult one to sustain. It involves, these frequent rear view mirror glances, yes. looking back from where we've came, right? To make sure that the new policies and procedures that were put in place 6 months ago, a year ago, 5 years ago, are still being adhered to, number one, and are they performing as intended, number two. So what we try to do in every RF Factor episode, I think, Ray, as you well know, is to ferret out those key leadership principles from the experiences of our guests, and then have a discussion on how they could positively impact change for the better. And so just for everyone's edification, I thought we should go over that. It's been a while since we've been back to here with the brief hiatus we took for a few weeks, but we're all glad to be back, and we got a great guest today.
Well, without further ado, we're going to be bringing in our guest, Robert Troyer, former U.S. attorney in Colorado from 2016 to 2018. While he was U.S. attorney, he did receive the Outstanding Contribution Award from the U.S. Attorney General. And get this, and this is why he's near and dear to our heart, is for developing and deploying innovative forensic intelligence, violent crime prevention strategies in Colorado. That's why he's near and dear to our heart, right?
Great crime gun intelligence center concept there operating in Colorado.
Absolutely. He was the first assistant U.S. attorney for 6 years before that. And in the early 2000s, he was a line criminal prosecutor in that office's drug and violent crime units. So I'm sure that he has seen a lot. And you're right. This is our first prosecutor, U.S. attorney we're actually going to have a conversation with. And I think that's so important, particularly you and I have talked about justice for victims, resolution for their families, and peace for the communities. Clearly, a U.S. attorney, clearly prosecutors play a major role in all three of those components. So now, before I bring Bob on, okay, because he's in the green room right now, how I met Bob was when we both served together on the National Crime Gun Intelligence Governing Board. The man is quite impressive, not only from, as what we just described, his prosecutorial acumen, but what I thought he was so incredibly remarkable at was just being a regular guy. And what I mean by that is this is the salt of the earth, this guy. And when you find out that he was a commercial fisherman in the summer. There's something to be said for that. I definitely want to tease that out of him. And hopefully, if I can bring him on, I can almost get a smile on his face now, as maybe we can lead right into this whole, what's this juxtaposition of a U.S. attorney, commercial fisherman, working with your hands, tough work. We've all watched the show on TV. Really tough stuff. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well, man. It's great to be on. I'm a big admirer of you guys, and uh, been honored to be a part of a lot of conversations and a lot of work with you guys. So really honored to be on the program and have a chance to talk about some of this stuff. I'm not sure if I can put together on the spot a direct connection between 20-hour days leaning over the side of a boat and gaffing salmon and forensic intelligent policing, but maybe I can construct an argument during the course of this
Oh,
deal.
I bet you can. I guess they both take innovation, right?
I learned a lot of stuff doing that job. One of the things I learned doing that job is it's it's really satisfying, but it's really hard work. And everybody I worked with who had done it for a career was missing an eye or a digit or a
Wow.
limb or something. It's really dangerous and really hard work. And I used to tell prosecutors this all the time when they complained about their chairs not being comfortable or their office not buying a big enough briefcases. I would say, man, it is so much easier to make your living with your brain, with your head, not your hands. That
Yes.
I'm not hearing a lot of that. But yeah, those were the glory days, gentlemen. But
Yeah.
I bet you guys want to talk more about
Well,
leader.
hey, look, let me just start off here, and I don't want to monopolize the introduction because I know Pete's got a lot to say. He's been itching to have you on, but my feeling is that when you're connecting, and this is what I got from you, you're a regular guy. You have not forgotten where you came from. Certainly, just by that, I'll call it a hobby of yours or a passion of doing the commercial fisherman work. You can clearly identify with the regular guy or gal out there, and I think that's incredibly important uh, when you're practicing law, right? Particularly as a prosecutor. But in doing my research on you prior to this, I did find a story about you where you were being hailed for this notion of, if we're going to be out there enforcing the law, we need to find the right people rather than target an entire community. It's less disruptive and it's a heck of a lot more effective. And the faster we can identify those offenders, the better it's going to be for the community. Now, and I'm going to steal from Pete here, that requires the right blend of people, processes, and technology. So, if you don't mind, maybe you could just sort of, how did you come to that conclusion? Because I've been around the block for quite a few years, and whether it's the police, the prosecutors, or forensic experts, not everybody thinks of it that way about precision. So maybe you can spend a little time on that.
It's interesting. I mean, all the way back to the commercial fishing days and before, probably. I guess I'm 60 years old now. I have been much more of an experiential learner. When I've learned a lot by actually doing the thing and observing and learning lessons from whatever the thing is. And when I was first a prosecutor, basically, there was no, at least in Colorado, there was no forensic intelligence used in violent crime prosecution. It was the old school, hey, if we got a spike in violent crime, let's have a press conference and announce that this summer we're going to take every single guy who's caught with a gun he shouldn't have is going to get prosecuted federally. And we're going to have billboards that tell people in the community, hey, if you're caught with a gun, you're going to go away to federal prison in Yankton, South Dakota. And, that kind of stuff. And we were taught, hey, the length of the rap sheet is a proxy for the dangerousness of the offender. And we were taught that the more convictions, the more safety. And we were taught that the longer the sentences, the more safety. And we were taught that intervention and reentry is irrelevant to safety. And, I swallowed all that stuff because I was new at it. And I hate to tell you, looking back on it, I did that for 6 years and put a lot of guys in prison for various gun crimes, particularly the federal felon in possession charge. And an agent or a detective would come into my office and say, got a great case for you. Last night, this dude was driving with his tail light out. We got him, gun in the console. He confessed, and he's a really bad dude because he's got 3 felonies. And it wasn't until I became the first assistant, and then really when I became the U.S. attorney, when you're really in a chair where you have to make resource allocations, you have to stand up in front of community leaders and elected officials and justify your existence and the function and the effectiveness of your office, that you start thinking, do I really know if any of those guys I put in prison ever even pulled the trigger of those guns they had? And I do not know. I obviously I had some cases where I do know, and I did some bigger cases where there were drug murders and things like that. But in your run-of-the-mill felon in possession case, I have no idea if I increased or improved things for any community anywhere by locking those guys up on big federal sentences. And I think it was reflecting on that, and then also seeing how much had changed with forensic intelligence, how much these tools from IBIS to the acoustic resonance gunshot detection systems, to license plate readers, to these great new computer systems that can aggregate all of that data very quickly and direct very busy detectives and agents toward really substantial leads toward the most dangerous people. I mean, I just fell in love with that stuff, finding myself in a chair where the decisions I made about resources and case choices were the final decisions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, I mean, we just had experience after experience with, actual tangible, not just big words used in meetings, but tangible experiences with the community feeling the difference, and not having a 12-month prosecution where you get a guy after you've flooded a particular neighborhood with 100 cops stopping everybody for spitting on the sidewalk.
Right.
And at the end of the day, some guy they know is not really part of the problem goes to federal prison for 2.5 years. That doesn't mean much to them, and frankly, it doesn't mean much to the prosecutors. Prosecutors want to make a difference. They want their work to make a difference. They don't want to be functionaries who are just warehousing people. They don't want to be hated by the community. They don't want to not know whether they're making a difference. So they love data-directed prosecution because you're getting the right people. You're appreciated. And you've spent your time on something that might make it safer to walk to school in a neighborhood.
So you mentioned earlier that you were searching for a link between your fishing experience and your prosecution experience. And as you're reciting this, I'm thinking back that there must have been a time when the thinking in the fishing industry was, let's put more lines in the water, let's throw more bait on the lines, and never really knowing if that was really going to help you catch more fish. But there came a time when data-driven technology came in the form of fish finders, and so now you're cruising out there in the canyons, and your fish finder is telling you that there's a school of whatever you're looking for right underneath you.
Yeah,
that's what it sounds
Wow.
No, that and that's true. I've actually stayed in touch a little bit with that industry. Where I was fishing was offshore, kind of west of Yakutat in southeast Alaska. And the technology, it's a very good comparison, Pete, because the technology has changed. The precision of the navigation technology, the fish finding technology, but also back to this point about aggregating data, the technologies that combine um, the fish finding imagery with temperature and current speed data,
right.
because those are relevant factors to the bait fish populations, which are obviously what draw the predator fish.
Wow.
So
it is very similar in that sense.
And it goes beyond that, I would think, because not only is it valuable tactically to find the fish, but it's valuable strategically to learn how to find fish in the future, and what the environmental factors and demographic factors are that you need to take into consideration. So I think there's very much an analogy between the two today.
Yeah. That's a very good point. Had not thought about that. Look at you guys. You're brilliant.
Yeah, we're not brilliant. But
well, Ray's not brilliant, but let's be honest. No, I don't. I mean, I'll just tell you, one of the very early crime gun intelligence cases we did was based on, the IBIS data and some other data that told us that 95% of the violence in a particular neighborhood near a fairly new light rail station in Denver was being caused by a handful of people. And so we did a case that resulted in federal prosecution of just 2 or 3 guys. And the community, frankly, didn't even know it was going on. There was none of the old surge police presence kind of tactic. And it happened really fast. The prosecution happened in the course of a shooting cycle that was ongoing over a couple of months. And when we arrested these guys and did the press conference about it, we talked a little bit about the techniques that had been used with ShotSpotter and NIBIN and other forensic intelligence. This is, I'm told, I mean, it was certainly the only time in my 15 years in the office that this happened. And I'm told nobody can think of a time it ever happened before or since. Well, I don't know about since, but before then. We did the press conference on a Friday, and I got a voicemail. I was in the office on Saturday. It wasn't actually, it was an attempted voicemail. Anyway, the phone rings again on a Saturday, and I pick it up, and it was an older African-American gentleman who wouldn't identify himself, but he had navigated through our phone system and found my direct number. And he just said, "I'm not going to tell you who I am. I've never done anything like this before. But I wanted to thank you guys for the way you did this. You did it right. I'm in my 70s. I've never seen law enforcement done like this. You got the exact right guys. Everybody knew who they were.
Wow.
But there's one other guy I think you should also know,
Good.
and
Yeah.
actually gave us some intelligence that then I then passed on to the Crime Gun Intelligence Center. But that's very rare for U.S. attorneys to get a phone call like that from a guy who lived there right near the light rail station, who saw how it was done and who was prosecuted and the speed with which it happened. And not only was appreciative, but trusting enough. And the guy whose name that he gave us was the guy who was the primary supplier of the firearms to the folks in that area.
Wow.
So, that stuff never happened with, hey, this guy's a bad guy because he's got 4 felonies.
And trust is such an important element in policing today, the ability to reinforce trust amongst the community that they serve. And that this kind of thing just fosters trust.
Yeah.
Now, so you get it, Ray gets it, I get it. How does everybody get it? What do we do? What are we missing here? Why aren't people rushing to this? And why isn't this just exploding across all the prosecutors' offices and forensic labs and police departments across the country? What is it that
The
what do we
secret
need to
sauce.
do? Yeah, what do we need to do to make it happen?
Relentless follow-up.
There you go.
I love it.
I mean, listen.
We took you right down the cow chute, man.
No, I mean, that used to frustrate. It still frustrates me. It really frustrated me when I was U.S. attorney, because once you see the light, I mean, certainly once you get a phone call like that, you're all in.
Right.
I mean, you're not going to do anything different from that going forward, right? And the folks who prosecuted those cases, I mean, I was just the U.S. attorney. I mean, the guys who actually did the work, their life's never going to be the same when they hear that. They're always going to do it that way. But until then, until you have an experience like that, it sounds like words, and it requires change, gentlemen.
Yes. Oh,
Tell
yeah.
me how much prosecutors and cops like to change.
Yeah. And you've actually done some work about instituting change in terms of communicating these best practices within your prosecutor community. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
I've tried, sure. I've tried to do that when I was on the governing board with Pete, when I was U.S. attorney within the Department of Justice, and since then, I've continued to do it by creating what's called a prosecutor's toolkit that tries, with the help of a lot of people, including you two. It's been very well received in its short life. It just came out, and now I'm rolling out a bunch of different trainings, and will happily participate in some of those with you guys. But it basically is written by a prosecutor for prosecutors, meaning it's short, it explains things in plain terms, and it gives them some ways to save time and energy. It gives them some canned outlines for certain kinds of witnesses, some canned language you could use in affidavits, some canned language you can use in motions, hearings, and arguments with the court, just to make things easier to adopt this new language and this new approach, and to avoid screwing it up. I mean, part of what the three of us and others who've seen the light can be concerned about with technology is if the folks on the law enforcement, the prosecution side, are not careful to get it right and be precise in their language, what it is and what it isn't, how much it proves and how much it where it falls short and needs to be supported by other evidence. If you play fast and loose with it, you're going to get judges and written rulings that become the law of the land saying, I couldn't quite understand what this witness and prosecutor were saying, but to me, it sounds like a match point lead or a firearm confirmation, a hit with this thing is no better than an anonymous tip. And man, that sets back this, this intelligent forensic led policing a long way. If we don't have the people in the judiciary and the public understanding it properly, because it's handled carefully by prosecutors. The prosecutor really, you touched on this before, but it's an interesting experience. I mean, I always thought of it as sort of the pinch point in the hourglass. You have all these different law enforcement agencies and crime lab functions, from technicians to firearm examiners to other scientists, up here at the top, feeding information down through a very narrow gap. A single person or two's got to understand that stuff, expect that it's being communicated precisely to him or her, digest it, and then feed it down through that pinch point to the public, right? To juries, to the media who are attending trials and court hearing, to the judiciary who's going to interpret it and either accept it or reject it. And so prosecutors in particular are in a position where they have to see the light. They have to adopt the power of this stuff, but they have to be careful with it.
And when you speak about that pinch point, what's coming through that pinch point, the prosecutor has to determine that it's admissible. So there could be tons of information flowing into the pinch point, but if it's not right, it doesn't pass down to the bottom.
Right. That's exactly right. And that that can lead to tension between law enforcement and prosecutors.
Exactly.
You guys know?
Oh, yeah.
And
Oh, yes.
that's a relationship that, if it's handled right, in my experience, in that 15 years of my career, those were the most satisfying relationships I had, were with the agents and cops who brought me cases and with whom I worked to prepare cases. They can be the relationships of the greatest conflict if they're not handled with care, because my sense of it, at least, you guys would know better than I do, that law enforcement personnel can be frustrated that they have to deal with this egghead wearing a suit and tie who's asking them all kinds of questions and citing rules of evidence that don't make sense to him. And, if I'm a cop, I'm sitting there going like, why do I even need this dude? Why do we have a system that requires this guy to put people in jail? Can't I just put this guy in prison myself without dealing with this bonehead?
Hey, Bob, I just want to interject for a second, and I think I might know where you're going with this, but I want to give a little context here. Personally for me, and I don't know, maybe because I was at the state and local level, I don't know if Pete felt the same way, but when it came to a U.S. attorney or the attorney general, there was this huge mystique that surrounded the individual. And you knew they were important. You also knew they had power as it related to change. As you said before, one thing that cops hate is change, or I should say two things that cops hate: change and things that stay the same. But needless to say, whenever the U.S. attorney or the attorney general would engage in an initiative, you would see there would be a little bit more grease to sort of stimulate the whole gears of change. But there's still a mystique around that, and I think what I was lacking in all those years was that civics lesson on sort of the power of the prosecutor in that avenue of justice, resolution, and peace. And I think that's where maybe you're going with that, but I wanted to give a little bit of a context. I know for me, that mystique, I was always blinded by what's happening here. Is this magic? And clearly, it would always come down to the individual. Some were better than others at leading change.
Right. Right. And you really do have to have the top people leading it. You can get lucky and get an individual prosecutor at a lower level who sees the light and is going to, at least on his or her cases, adopt these kinds of practices and be all in. But you need someone supervising those gun prosecutors, if not the U.S. attorney himself, saying, look, you need that person going to the police chiefs, the lab directors, the ATF special agent in charge, the FBI special agent in charge, and you need it to be handled. You need it to be handled right. You can't force it down their throat. Both sides have power. If I marched into the ATF SAC's office and said, we're not taking any more cases from you unless they're supported by the full host of crime gun intelligence processing. And you know what? They can turn off the flow of cases as well. And pretty soon there's egg on the U.S. attorney's face too, because the prosecutor's office isn't getting the cases worked up. The same way, the cops can't go to court and get somebody convicted without a prosecutor. The prosecutor can't investigate and create a case and develop the evidence without the agent and the detective. But if you handle it right, if you go to those places, whether it's elected officials or the local ATF leadership, and say, man, we are really seeing all of these benefits. I mean, my people have never worked harder and been happier and more motivated. Their work has meaning again. They see the value. We get these phone calls. The public loves it. Our stature is being raised within DOJ, so they're giving us a couple of more. They're giving us budget for 2 more violent crime prosecutors because we're having results. So what can we do together to make all the cases that come in based on crime gun intelligence, target identification, and not based on the old way of prosecuting felon in possession? I have a great, this is another true story that I saw when I was the first assistant U.S. attorney that illustrates the difference between the new and the old way that I have to tell. It kind of fits here, but the classic way when I was a gun prosecutor that we would do things was still being done when I first came back to the office. And I watched the trial of a case where we had a guy who had been jammed up at the state level on a bunch of very low level traffic type of stuff, but he was a well-known gang member. So when they interviewed him, when they arrested him and said, hey, we have some leverage over you, the guys, what can you do to help yourself here? What can you give us to lessen your own troubles? The guy says, well, I know some people who have guns. So, the DPD guy called, the Denver Police Department guy calls in the ATF guy, and the ATF guy sits down, and this gangster literally writes down a name on a Post-it note and says, I can set up a buy and I can buy a gun from this guy and he's a felon. Okay, great. So the guy gets a break on his state case. He gets out, sets up the undercover, acts as an intermediary, contacts. Well, the guy he's contacting, it turns out, is his little homie. All right. He's a guy he has a gang relationship with. The guy who knows if he ever had a gun in the first place? He probably did, but when his big homie says, I need to buy a gun from you, the guy goes and gets a gun. He shows up and we arrest the little homie and we're doing a case on him. Well, then the big homie has to testify in the trial. Okay. This case starts, the level of intelligence that informed this federal prosecution was a Post-it note. All right. And here we are in trial. That after the trial's over and the big homie testifies, he gets shot in a retaliatory shooting. After he gets shot, one of his family members shoots a family member of the guy who shot him. And we've put in federal prison for 2 years after a trial and all those resources, a guy who I have no idea if he ever pulled the trigger of a gun, and we've created 3 more shootings. Okay. And so, that's the kind of thing that when you're sitting down to talk to other leaders who allocate resources and who are telling their agents what kind of cases we want and don't want, and who are telling police chiefs what kind of cases we do and don't want, and what kind of practices we favor and don't favor, that brings it all home. You contrast that with the case where I ended up getting the phone call where we get these couple of guys who are doing all the shooting at this light rail station. And people get it, and they'll come along eventually, even if they don't like change, and even if there's some missteps and some conflict along the way.
So I mean, the way I view it, I view it in a very similar way. But really, what we're talking about is between the police, the forensic community, and the prosecutors, they're partners. They're operating maybe on separate tracks, but they're all headed towards the same objective, the same goal. So what we're really talking about here is being able to manage relationships and to think and act together. And I guess the word is collaboration. And when there's true collaboration and people are thinking and acting together, this becomes a lot easier to do. If one partner tries to exert and throw their weight around and force the other two into doing something, it's not going to work. If one partner makes an independent decision that can adversely affect the other two, we're going in the wrong direction. And case in point, and I'm not picking on labs, but some labs make a decision that they're not going to capture a certain mark on a piece of ballistics evidence that can and should be captured and entered into the database. Well, with some certain kinds of firearms that I'm not going to identify them here, I'm not going to give criminals an education, but if they're not...
Do you have a lot of criminals who watch this?
I don't know, but with our backgrounds, who knows? But if they're not taking these marks, if the lab decides, well, I'm not going to take a certain mark, and they don't do it, there are some firearms that will not show up in the database unless you're taking those marks. So it's that kind of a decision made unilaterally by a lab can have an enormous negative effect, not only on the police investigators, but on the prosecutors as well, because we're not going to link those guns and those suspects.
And Peter, I think, and I've had these conversations with Bob recently, is that because of the the different communities within the law enforcement community, I should say the different disciplines within the law enforcement community, in terms of the forensic, the investigative, the prosecutorial, as well as the command side of a law enforcement organization, where they don't habitually or frequently spend time around the water cooler talking, that a lot of this is foreign. So that decision that might be made, whether it's in a lab or whether it's in a prosecutor's office or in a detective bureau, may not ever be known to that other stakeholder until it's too late. and at the same time, there's never that feedback loop. So that's what makes it difficult. And I've had this conversation with Bob, where particularly at the federal level, there always seems to be this reliance on from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Hey, my case agent, they can handle everything from soup to nuts, which we know in this realm, particularly with forensics, with local intelligence that might be available about a given suspect or its associations. No one person can do it alone.
And your point is well taken, that the initiative, the violent crime reduction initiative has to have built into that a requirement that the various stakeholders are brought to the table together to think and act together. You have to force this interaction. If you leave everyone to do their daily work in their individual stovepipes without some agreement, the programmatic aspect has to be one of bringing the right people to the table to think and act together. That's the process we're going to follow. And all of us.
And Pete, I think you would agree that while that can be done by a myriad of champions that hail from the different food groups, as we like to call it, it would seem that from the prosecutorial entity, whether it's at the state or whether it's the U.S. Attorney's Office, they seem to be in a really good place to sort of engender that type of collaboration.
When they call the meeting, people come. I mean,
Right.
that's the issue. You get some mid-level player somewhere else who calls a meeting for other agencies, and nobody comes. So it's like sending out invitations to the birthday party. You want people to come.
Right. Bob, your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, that's one of the things I enjoyed about that job. That was the one period in my life where when I sent out invitations, people showed up.
There you go.
and they probably laughed at your jokes.
I tell you what, I really miss that.
Me too.
It has not happened in a long time. My kids, who do a very good job keeping me in line, while I was U.S. attorney, I told some joke at the dinner table after work one day, and no one laughed. And I said, "What's wrong with you people? Everybody at the office laughed at that just earlier today." My daughter goes, "You're their boss, buddy."
So true. So true.
So
Yes.
I don't. What's interesting is not all people in those positions, whether it's U.S. attorney himself or one of the managers a level or two below, also who have an incredible amount of power to direct the kinds of cases that are going to get done and going to get accepted, and therefore they can really affect law enforcement behavior. They don't always see that. They don't always see that they have that power. And it took me a minute to realize that when I came back to the office. And one of the things that it took me a minute to realize also is how important what Pete just said about processes really are. Because you do have a lot of moving pieces in a crime gun intelligence center, and those things have to move right, and people have to understand what happened with each piece and then communicate it correctly to the prosecutor. And I know people hate more process and more rules and protocols and procedures, but things like the minimum required operating standards in a crime gun intelligence center lab, in a lab that's using IBIS, man, they save everybody involved from all kinds of problems, and they make life much easier if they're in place.
In place before the crime occurs.
Exactly.
You don't change the tire on the car when you're driving 60 miles an hour down the highway, right?
Yeah. And you guys know better than I do, but I mean, I'm always amazed at how much anyone in law enforcement has to go through training, policy changes, retraining on new policies. And I completely get it that if that's your career, when someone says new policy or new training, your immediate reaction is to tune out.
Here we go again.
Here we go again, and it's just going to change again and whatever. So I came to believe that those putting the right processes in place, being thoughtful about what they are, putting them in place, but being patient in explaining them. And again, it's that relentless follow-up, just not giving up and doing it again and again and again. And there's a lot of turnover in prosecutors' offices too. In a U.S. attorney's office, typically the people doing the gun prosecutions and the violence prosecutions do that for a little while, and then they move to more complex cases in other parts of the office after a few years. And so every few years you have to refresh all of that for it really to get woven into the fabric of these different institutions. You just
Amen. And look, add to that, really, if we just generally speaking, the food groups, right? The prosecutors, the cops, their commanders and analysts as another food group, and then the forensic techs. They all have their own language, and they all have their different missions and their different goals. And again, you particularly when you're in this environment here, you where we're looking at sort of pre-monetary or forward-leaning or intelligence to support investigative leads, but you have a lab that, rightly so, historically speaking, was very much involved with evidence to support a prosecution. And now you're sort of asking them like, yeah, keep doing that, but we also want you to tweak things a little bit so you could give us information like now so we can go use that to prevent or interdict a crime that's about to occur. And it's like, well, wait a minute. You're telling me that you want this piece of evidence to come into the lab to jump over something that's been sitting there for a couple of weeks? Yes, it's a higher priority. Wait a minute, that doesn't compute. So again, to Pete's point, you cannot have these conversations in the heat of the moment. They have to be thought through. You have to speak about them, and everyone has to have a seat at the table to have these discussions of when is it appropriate to sort of jump that and say, hey, we need this, because if we don't address this now, we are going to have additional bloodshed, something that we could have stopped if we had this piece of information in the next couple hours.
Yeah, that's right. And that it took me a while to realize that as well, how tricky that is with labs and how much of a shift it is in their sort of mentality. And you can't expect that to happen overnight. I don't, what you're sort of suggesting is something that I found worked with elected officials, with the kind of people who can call the lab director and say, this is going to happen. And the lab director doesn't have any choice. And it's that combination. And, you guys are, you and a handful of others are the ones who taught me all this stuff. So it's not like I'm inventing it, but I just happen to have my own experiences with it. The advocacy that says, look at all these values sort of in the abstract, and also think about what happens when a 6-year-old is killed and we find out that we had a shell casing.
Wow.
In our evidence room for 10 months, that if that had been run through NIBIN, we would have targeted this guy as a serial shooter and we would have taken that gun off the street. And the combination of, you could get the phone call from the thankful community member, and you also might not want to be the mayor when that shell casing that languished on your in your lab 10 months longer than it should have comes to light, and this kid's family sues the city.
And the 60 Minutes news team comes knocking on your door.
Right.
I agree.
And you gotta, that's a little bit delicate, but it's that combination of things that tends to focus the thinking of the decision makers who can say to a chief, say to a lab director, say to an ATF SAC, you know what, buddy, we're going to do this.
And I think the nuance here is that a lot of this technology that's enabling this crime gun intelligence today has only been around for about 20 years, which really isn't that much time.
Yeah.
And so when it first was introduced, it was a novelty. People were looking at it as, does this thing work or doesn't it work? But so back then, I could understand a decision where someone, a police chief or a lab director or a mayor or whomever, a congressman who appropriates money, didn't put a lot of stock or attention into new crime gun intelligence. But now, over the past 20 years, whether we're talking about gunfire detection, license plate readers, NIBIN, IBIS, whether we're talking about DNA, today, 20 years later, these are mainstream value-added technologies. So these are the things that you mentioned before about, do I have a gun that's been hiding in my evidence room that has not been traced, that has not been NIBINized? That should be keeping police chiefs up at night. That should be, do I have a cartridge case that's sitting in my lab waiting to be entered for 10 months? That's what should be keeping lab directors up at night. And am I giving my police officers in my community, as the mayor or the governor or whomever the chief executive is, am I giving them the tools that they need to do the job today, that are available to do the job? That should be keeping them up at night.
I just as you're describing that, Pete, and I'm gonna do my best here to sort of maybe paint a picture, and just bear with me a second, both of you. But I remember when I was a young kid, my parents were completely against it, but somehow I convinced them that I needed this. I think it was a little chameleon or some sort of lizard that I wanted. And my parents were concerned because it required feeding and they did not want to do it. And I just thought, well, this is really straightforward, right? I go to the pet store, I buy food, and then I go and I feed this animal, this reptile. I go to the pet store and I purchase a whole bag of crickets. And I remember like it was yesterday, I guess the terrarium that I had was sitting just off the family room in my mom's beautiful furnished area. And here were these lizards by the window, or the chameleons, whatever they were. And I remember opening up the lid and I go to throw out like one cricket and the whole bag. And these crickets ran all over the place. I didn't expect any of that. They found themselves immediately down these little nooks and crannies, like into the floorboards and gone. And my parents were not around. I don't think I've ever told them that story, but needless to say, I think what happens here is that when whether it's a prosecutor, a chief of police, the head of a forensic entity, a fusion center, they look at this is very straightforward. We're just going to take, say, NIBIN information, and we are going to be able to solve crimes immediately, not realizing that there's all these little crickets that are running in a million different directions. And how do you bring order to that? How do you channel that so there's these handoffs and handshakes that are going on, and that requires special champions. So there's another reason I brought up crickets, because Bob, I understand that you actually raise crickets as well. So there has to be some parallel here as we're sort of, want to have this discussion of how do you herd crickets.
I love it.
Okay. As you're trying to advance crime gun intelligence.
I told you he was sneaky. I told you, Bob. I warned you.
Oh, no, and I should have known better. I mean, I've been dealing with Ray for a while. I should have known this was going to come up. The whole cricket soldier fly larva business, which I actually spent a lot of time trying to get set up right after I stepped down as U.S. Attorney, got interrupted by some other things like the investigation of the Catholic Church.
Yes. Okay. That's a big thing. Yes.
So I've not picked that back up, Ray. But yes, I will tell you that that may happen someday. But I can tell you in the meantime, the people in Denver who really, people like Jeff Russell from ATF, primarily Jeff Russell, and other leaders who supported him, and a lot of other, a good lab director, et cetera. The thing they did from the beginning that was very smart is, even after all those crickets hopped out of the bag, they decided to catch one cricket at a time.
Wow.
And you know, in the early days of this thing, when it was dicey and it wasn't proven and a lot of people were watching, they did a really good job of saying, let's do our best to get one success, and then let's talk about that success. Let's learn and streamline from that success. Now let's get another success, and let's do some stuff like, when we had a case that was probably our biggest case, a guy who ended up getting 2 state homicide convictions, a 30-year federal violent crime and native racketeering conviction, a 6-year federal sentence on top of that. And that whole case started, that was a guy involved in 15 shootings and 5 homicides. And no one, he didn't have much of a rap sheet at all. It never would have been on anyone's radar screen. No one would even talk about him. So he's not on anybody's list in law enforcement as the worst of the worst. That whole case started with a cop on a cold night getting out of his car after a gunshot detection system signal, going to the location, getting out of his car and searching around with a flashlight in the freezing cold and finding a single shell casing.
Wow.
So part of the brilliance early on in Denver was the communication after the success, which includes giving that officer an award and highlighting for everyone in the police department that picking up that one shell casing solved a couple of homicides and definitely prevented a number more homicides, because this guy was shooting somebody every 10 days in the spring of 2015. And so, you know, getting the processes right, but then turning around and showing the results to people and thanking and giving an award to the tech who did the NIBIN entries, giving an award to the cop who picked up that first shell casing from the innocuous unlawful discharge case that became the gold mine for the later evidence, right, that got him convicted on our 30-year federal case. You know, all those things, a lot of time and attention, right? Catching that first cricket. And then it starts getting easier to catch the other crickets. And you know, the thing that I think turbocharged things in Denver for us, when I was U.S. Attorney, was, and again, like most things, it took me a while to learn this. Stuff doesn't dawn on me immediately, but it dawned on me after a little while that the otherwise hostile people in the community and on the city council love these stories. They love having data. They love being able to tell their voters, we spent X amount
Precision
on these match point machines because these are the machines that tell us that 40% of our crime is happening in this 3-block radius And you know what else we've learned from all the data we've got? Because we have this kind of machine. The average age of our shooters is 22.3 years old. The average number of felony convictions is 1.4. Only 1 out of 8 of those convictions is a drug convictions. Most of the convictions that point you to a guy who's going to be willing to shoot somebody with a gun, not just carry a gun, are bold crimes, property crimes, juvenile crimes, were not even necessarily violence, but lack of concern about other people and their property are on display. And you start getting all those statistics and telling city council and telling the police chief. And I mean, they love it, as they should, because it shows you are responsibly allocating your resources to improve conditions in a community instead of waiting till it gets to a crisis point, swooping in with a bunch of militaristic stuff that just confirms what they think about the police. All of those things, from giving an award to the cop who finds the shell casing to having special meetings with city council where you give them this data that justifies their spending decisions on their lab, and everybody buys in. But again, it's that relentlessness that's required, because people can drift back. We had an experience. I mean, we had an experience where even in a press conference where you're talking about this kind of forensic intelligence success, there's gonna be a commander, there's gonna be an ATF SAC who can't help himself and say, this guy's rap sheet told us he was the worst of the worst. And you just go, oh, man, okay.
So, well, what's very interesting about the conversation in the last 2 minutes is that we've shifted from the tactical use and value of crime gun intelligence to the strategic use and value of crime gun intelligence collected over the long term. When we talk about things like statistics that you mentioned, that you could parrot back to your policymakers to show them the value of their investment. Not only that, but the use of that data can also be useful to the administrators of the different agencies to develop new strategies and tactics for the future moving forward. So I have 2 questions along those lines that and they both surround NIBIN. It's near and dear to my heart. And one has to do with the use of NIBIN data strategically in terms of what we hear today about bail reform. And yet, if we've got a shooter and we've got a known trigger puller, should they be able to be out on bail? And then number 2, the use of NIBIN data strategically for sentencing guidelines, for example, especially when it comes to, and I'd like to hear your experience with straw purchasers, because a gun that a straw purchaser provides to a criminal is a time bomb, a ticking time bomb that goes out into the community. At some point in the future, that thing is going to go off. So, but on the other hand, historically, straw purchasers didn't be viewed by the court, weren't viewed by the court as that big a deal. It was a paper violation. That's what I would hear when I was an agent. So maybe you could speak to the strategic use of NIBIN data in terms of dangerousness for bail and in terms of raising sentencing guidelines for crimes that should get more attention from the court.
Those are all very important areas and things that I talk about and things we address in the toolkit. NIBIN, I think, is the solution that's hiding in plain sight on this political debate about bail reform. I'm all for bail reform, and I think the meeting place between the right and the left politically on this is everybody gets out on bail unless the prosecutor shows NIBIN evidence that links, and I'm simplifying it, right? But if the prosecutor presents at the bond hearing evidence that links this shooter to numerous crimes, you could basically write a rule into the system that says upon presentation of that evidence that we have a suspected serial shooter, this individual is going to be held for automatically going to be held for 72 hours. You could have a second step that says we'll come back in 72 hours. And if there is microscopic comparison that confirms the connection, or additional evidence that confirms the connection of this individual to those events, he's going to be held without bond until trial.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be a pretty simple change in the system that I think both sides would like to see. Over the last, since the call for bail reform sprung up, we've gotten lucky, I think, in a way. We've very quickly learned that the proposed political solution has led directly to more loss of life.
Absolutely.
It's undisputed. And so we need something in between. The answer is not to go back to everybody is held until trial.
Right.
The answer is to use what we've already got available to us that allows us to identify those people who are most likely to shoot somebody else before their trial. And just let us put that evidence in and let you hold them for 72 hours until I can come back with that proof.
Absolutely.
And, on sentencing, Pete, there are already good mechanisms in the federal sentencing guidelines for enhancements and aggravators that we can put on proof at sentencing without the rules of evidence applying. You don't even need the firearm examiner. You can have the ATF agent, the case agent, or a detective summarize secondhand what evidence you have from the lab.
Mm-hmm.
We did it in that case I talked about where this guy got a 30-year sentence, where we presented somebody from the Denver lab, the firearms examiner from the Denver lab came in and showed this whole link analysis that included GPS data from an ankle bracelet and cell phone GPS data, and the links between the shell casings that put this guy beyond dispute at 8 of these scenes. And when the judge saw that, he reacted the way everybody who hears about it reacts. He gave him the maximum enhancement he could give him. And he even said, we have judges, we have federal judges all over the political spectrum, but we have plenty of federal judges whose response to federal gun cases is, why is this case in my court and not in state court?
Correct.
And when my prosecutors could say, let me tell you why, I'm glad you asked. We had judges, we had even our most liberal judges saying, this is great. Now I feel good about what I'm doing. I feel good about why this is a federal case. And I feel good about the sentence I'm giving this guy, because I'm not, basing it on some 1950s view that the length of the rap sheet equals improved public safety, right? I'm not just warehousing people, but I can go home at night and I know that this length of sentence is appropriate because you showed me that this guy was pulling the trigger every 9.8 days for 60 straight days. I mean, that's the level of precision you can have that gives comfort to, the community, to jurors, to judges, and it puts a bounce in the step of everybody on the law enforcement and the prosecution side to know that's what you're doing with your time.
Absolutely.
Outstanding.
So, Bob, we've been talking for quite some time, and seems like we're going to have you on again in the future, because I think we can get another probably 8 hours out of you. But I sort of want to end on this note here. I probably had about 14, 15 years on the job and I was starting to recognize that I wanted to move into the command side of a law enforcement organization. And while I was coming to that realization, it it was quite evident that I needed to rely on what the military calls graybeards, those folks that have been there, done that, and have a lot to offer in terms of insight, advice, and guidance. And because it's so often that when you're in the mix, there's so much going on, you don't often take the time to sort of look around and um, sort of cull out those things that are elementally are really important to advance your leadership, advanced initiatives. So I find myself now, I'm a graybeard. While I might have shaved, I am now a graybeard in a lot of ways, mainly because I've retired, but two, I've gone gray. But you're a graybeard now, and you have a tremendous amount of insight. We've teased out a lot of that from you today, and clearly the RF factor is about leadership. Okay, it's about understanding initiatives. It's about looking in that rearview mirror. So, with that said, and just to end on this note, if you can step into either Pete or my shoes today, what would you have asked yourself over the last hour?
I guess I would have asked myself, it's probably all stuff we've covered because, as you've noticed, no matter what you ask me, I'm going to say what I want to say anyway.
I like it.
You know, I guess now that I've had this conversation, what I would have asked was, how is leadership different from being a line prosecutor?
Mm.
I mean, what did you find different about being the guy actually with the 60 cases on your caseload and going into court? And I've just kind of done, I didn't really have any designs on leadership. I've just kind of done what was in front of me throughout my career. And I think I got lucky and I had a lot of great mentors. And I think I somehow I got to a point where the people who are a lot smarter than I am, but who didn't have as much common sense, start falling by the wayside because common sense and street smarts start becoming more important as you go in your career.
Mhm.
And so I think I ended up there in my higher positions more by accident and as a result of what my wife calls peasant cunning, more than common sense, more than book smarts. But when I got into leadership positions, I hadn't done any kind of leadership training. I hadn't thought about being a leader. I didn't really see myself as a leader. I wasn't really aware of it. It's kind of shocking, and it's kind of shocking to be in that position, and realize um, how much responsibility it is to make the final decision on things that are going to affect so many people's lives. Everybody in your office, everybody in the offices that your office works with, and the public. And so that was, it may sound naive or stupid or whatever, but that kind of shocked me how intense that feeling is. And then fairly soon after that, I had the equally shocking, just almost like physical feeling of, this is fucking awesome. because it's so easy just to be guided by what's going to make things safer. And if you could just not get wrapped up in other stuff and just always in these interminable meetings and budget discussions and whatever, just keep coming back to, at the end of the day, am I going to feel like this actually is making people safer? And so once I just kind of stumbled on that, and again, I wasn't reading any books or anything else. It was like, oh, this is actually fun, and it's easy. It's still a lot of pressure, and it's still very important. But if people would just could keep coming back to that, I think a lot of the rest of this stuff falls into place.
Well said.
And what you just described was the why. Why should we do any of this stuff to begin with? And everything should start with the why.
Right.
And your job gets a lot easier. The decisions that you make are easier to make. Outstanding way to end this.
Yeah. Gentlemen, that was a pleasure. Two of the greats. I assume your vast listening audience of criminals and and others in law enforcement. I hope they appreciate how much care goes into these things by you guys and how much experience you guys bring to this. So I appreciate the opportunity to be on.
How do we get your prosecutor's handbook to people? How do you do that?
Well, it's there's a link to it. It's available online. So I'm happy to do it. I mean,
I could attach it to the show notes too, Pete.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Well, can we do that? Is that okay?
Yep. Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Attach it to the show notes, or if you have any other way of distributing a link or a PDF, the thing is not proprietary, and the goal of the folks who make these machines is to get that thing out in every hand's willing to receive it.
I think that's a good solution, Ray, and that way we could push this out. Bob, you've got a lot of prosecutor contacts. When this thing comes out, maybe you could put it on your LinkedIn or whatever social media channel you have for yours, because we need to spread the word. People need to hear what you said today.
Well, nobody I know wants to listen to me talk for this long, but I'll try. I'll do my best.
This was great.
Bob, this was great. I can't thank you enough. I'm going to send you back in the green room here. We're going to conclude, but thank you so much for being a guest. I truly appreciated it. And
me too.
When you decide to raise those crickets, let me know. Maybe I could take another run at reptiles.
Yeah.
Okay?
Dude, based on that story, you're the last dude I'm allowing into my facility.
Oh my God.
Don't tell my mom.
Oh no, you were going to tell his mom. This is going right to his mom.
Are you kidding me? That's my first order of business after this call is to find your mother and tell her that story.
Oh my gosh. It's probably 40 years ago, but those crickets are probably still in the house somewhere.
She watches all of these podcast posts on the Chills YouTube channel, so she'll see it. I can't wait.
Listen, Pete, I gotta. You know what would allow me to die a happy man someday is if someday it could be the three of us hosting this podcast with Mrs. Guidetti as the guest.
Yeah, my mom has the wooden spoon still, so that's a problem for me. And,
the spanking machine, we called it.
That might come out with this cricket story. Oh, I got it. All right, sir. Thank you so much. Be safe.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Wow, Pete, that was.
Yeah, we could have kept talking all day,
and we will. We're going to have him back on. That was really, really impressive.
Yeah, it was. And I want to make sure that this gets to the right people to hear. I think it's important stuff that he discussed.
Yeah, incredible. Great hearing from him from that vantage point. So that was neat.
All right, my friend. Another job well done.
All right, pal. You be safe, and I'll talk to you soon enough.
Very good.